Thanks for taking the time to join us, everybody. Really appreciate you taking the minutes out of your busy day to cover another best practices. This one is going to be on project management, specifically for agencies that are producing content for their clients. We get a ton of questions about different project management styles, which are best, which ones fit for a particular type of agency, a team, the way that they run or build their clients. So we wanted to cover a couple of things with our partners at Verblio. So I'm joined by Paul, their VP of Marketing. Paul, how's your morning going?
It's going well. It's great to be here, Alex.
To hear. Awesome. Thanks for taking the time to join us. I know you had a lot to cover on this topic when we were prepping for this. It sounds like you have a lot of experience being a VP of Marketing around project management. Wondering if you can give everybody a little bit of background on why you're here.
Absolutely. I'm happy to. And I'm super excited to be here and talk to everybody. So I am Paul. I'm the VP of Marketing at Verblio. We are a content creation platform. We help agencies and businesses and digital marketers create content for SEO, content marketing, inbound marketing, all that good stuff. And I thought I might address the maybe obvious question of why is a marketing guy talking about project management? So I'm going to try to bring a couple of perspectives to this. The first is as a member of the exec team at Verblio, I sit on our product council, so I get to see our development team and our product team think a lot about project management. We use a lot of the techniques that we're about to talk about when we're figuring out where to take the Verblio product, how to build the platform. The second is that Verblio creates a heck of a lot of content. So we, in the last 12 months, produced over 60,000 pieces of unique content. And so we think a ton internally about how do we produce that much content at scale. And finally, I'm a total digital marketing nerd. 10 years ago, I saw Rand Fishkin speak out in Silicon Valley. And I was hooked. I carried around, if you remember, the original beginner's guide to SEO. I printed it out and carried it around in my bag for 2 years. I've been hooked on digital ever since. And so one of the coolest parts of my job is that I get to talk to literally hundreds of digital agencies and digital marketers about best practices in SEO and content, and specifically around their challenges in creating content at scale. So can bring that perspective as well, and super excited to dive in, Alex.
Very cool. Do you still have the SEO guide? Is that framed somewhere in your house?
It should be. I have no idea where it is. Probably drawn on by one of my daughters.
Oh, there you go. Perfect. It's colored now.
Yes.
Well, yeah, those of you that aren't familiar with me, Alex Guest, I run the partnership team here at Accelo. I'm here talking about project management because working with partners can be a project. It's mostly a joke, but in all reality, there's a lot of moving parts. I'm working with multiple stakeholders on multiple items. Sometimes it's around integrated technology. Sometimes it's around co-marketing. People are all across the country, inside and out. We produce content with our partners. And I'm driven by efficiency. I'm obsessed with it, and I actually really appreciate running some lean and agile style in my day-to-day life. Not entirely sure how my wife feels about that, but we can always check in later. So ultimately, this is going to be a divide and conquer when it comes to the different types of project management styles that we're going to be covering today. Paul is going to kick things off with Agile. I'm going to move over into the lean framework, one of my favorites. It's going to be back to Paul for Kanban, and then we're going to touch on waterfall a little bit. Have some data that I want to share with you guys later. Still a great project management format, but it seems like people are more curious about learning about new styles. So want to touch on it and want to see how some of the topics we're going to be covering before that might help optimize agencies without forcing them to go through an entire project management style or framework switch, because that takes a lot. So with that, everybody, I'm going to kick it over to Paul, and here we're going to learn a little bit about Agile.
Sounds like we should save project management in our personal lives for a separate webinar.
There you go. Yeah, somebody write it down.
So yeah, I'm going to talk about Agile. And I was remembering a conversation I had with my brother-in-law about 3 years ago. He does technical project management for a 40,000 person company, and they were switching from waterfall to agile. And I remember at the time thinking, waterfall, like, is that still a thing? And this was 3 years ago, but I guess we need to cut the big companies some slack. But Agile is really born out of some of the drawbacks with waterfall. And we'll talk a little bit about waterfall, as Alex said, at the end of this. But some of the strengths with Agile, it is designed to be more adaptive. So this idea that if you're too rigid with your project management, you're going to get caught up somewhere, or you're going to have to make a decision to continue doing something that you shouldn't be doing. So Agile is really focused on how do we be more evolutionary about it? How do we be more iterative? And how do we find this cycle of continuous improvement? And it's worth noting that the principles of Agiles also underpin some of these other project management styles that you probably heard of: Kanban, Scrum, etc. So I really like the Agile manifesto here. And these are concepts that I think apply broadly to whatever you're talking about. So this idea that individuals in interaction should trump processes and tools. You should focus on software over comprehensive documentation. I can't stand documenting stuff, so this is one of my favorite principles of Agile. But also, how do we collaborate with our customers as opposed to negotiating with our customers? And then responding to change over following a plan. One thing I wanted to call out on this slide is this idea that I'm sure heard the term sprints, and I think sprints are interesting when it comes to content in that they work sometimes, they don't work other times. We had a fantastic example of a perfect use case for a sprint in content creation. My team got the opportunity to create an ebook for HubSpot, and we literally dropped everything. The authors were myself, the two people that work for me, and our head of writers. And we did a perfect 2-week sprint and created an entire ebook from conception to design in that 2 weeks. So that's a great use for sprints in content creation. Worth noting, though, that it doesn't always work perfectly. I think especially if you're an agency and there are multiple stakeholders, you're relying on sign-offs from clients. Holding yourself to a perfect 2-week sprint might produce inferior content. So use it when it applies, don't force it. And finally, you've probably heard the term agile marketing bandied around. We borrowed this graphic from Scott Brinker at HubSpot, but I think agile marketing is worth digital marketers thinking about. So, how do we go from that sprint level that we just talked about all the way up to your marketing roadmap? And I think thinking about it with this structure allows you to be flexible, but also make sure that the individual work that you and your team are doing on a day-to-day basis really aligns all the way up to what your strategic goals are. And I'm going to turn it over to Alex for Lean.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks for diving into Agile. It's pretty interesting. I typically think of Agile as a product development format. Specifically, I've got friends that are engineers, they have their Scrum meetings or retrospectives, but I think there's definitely a place for it in marketing, specifically with content creation. There's a lot that gets produced. I think there's some efficiency that can be added from that style. Lean is actually one of my favorites, being driven by efficiency. I really like the mapping out the process around this, trying to cut out as much waste as possible. It just kind of fits with my personality. There are really 5 core concepts to Lean. We'll touch on each and how they relate to content. But number 1, you need to understand value, and that is a 2-sided equation, both internally and externally. Next, mapping the value stream, so how that value is created. Third, ensure that it flows, because it's great to have a plan, but if it doesn't happen, it's not driving any value. The 4th is an interesting one for agencies. It's around demand driving production. And then finally, continuous improvement. Take a look at it, break it apart if you need to, but always be improving. So one of the things that we like to do here at Accelo is better understand our agency partners and how we can help them succeed. Actually, a lot of the concepts around this entire webinar are based from an agency survey that we did, and we wanted to best understand what value to an agency looks like. The vast majority say that it's really around project deadlines and delivering for their clients. Makes sense. Without clients, you don't have an agency. So the big part of helping agencies better align to value is helping them understand how their clients derive value from their services. I think often we end up talking to our agency clients and users about what value they derive from Accelo, and we want to help them better understand how they provide value to their clients. Ask yourself, how often are you asking your clients the value you're building for them? Was it just something that you did when they were coming on board? And then who are you asking? If you're just asking the owners, you might be missing some potential value opportunities for the people that are doing the doing at their business. And you might not be serving them in a way that you could be. Ultimately, content's an interesting one because content has a million different applications. It can be a website, it can be blogs, it can be ads. Each one of those is going to have a different value associated with it. That value could build toward a different team. So unless you're asking those questions, there's not a great way to truly understand how you should be structuring your business and your client services around content to the end user value. I like to nerd out in a bunch of different platforms to visualize my process. I'm a very visual learner, and I also like to do things to learn. Some of my favorite platforms are Lucidchart, Draw.io, and honestly, same way this presentation was built, Google Slides. You can make workflows within all three programs. They all have free versions. And it's a great way to start to create design and graphic that is related to business processes. It's written, it can be visualized, it can be presented for the auditory learners in the crowd. It's just a good way to cover all bases.
Yeah, Alex, I'd just add that we just finished a week-long sprint with our development team, and we actually used Google Slides to build a working prototype that we then shared with prospective clients for their feedback. It was super cool.
No kidding, that's awesome. So it was a working prototype. Did it have video in it as well?
So it was clickable. So you can, in Google Slides, click, link elements in a slide to other slides. And so we built it all out so that if you clicked on a button in a slide, it would bring you to a different slide where that actual button in the software would take you.
Oh, no. Yeah, I think that's going to be my afternoon now. That sounds amazing. Man, I haven't tried that. I'm going to do that, actually. It's a good way to iterate on different concepts and process. It also could be a cool training tool.
Super cool. So this was based on the book Sprint by the Google Ventures team, which was really, really cool process to follow.
I'm going to check that out. Very cool. So yeah, I mean, it almost sounds like Google Slides might be your best option because you can map out these different processes. It sounds like you probably click into some of these shapes that are within these workflows and give additional details into that specific piece of the content creation.
100%.
We have time. I might try to build a framework for that and post it when we get the recording live for this. But yeah, so when you're building that, and I think I might actually try to help everybody out with it now, when you build out those workflows, you can use different items within those process to indicate different things. I like to use shapes to indicate teams and locations. Accelo is in a unique situation that we have offices in Australia, in California, and in Colorado. So using shapes helps everybody understand where the people are that are going to be part of that project. So you can communicate with them when it's their morning or it's not their weekend or day off. We often face that issue with Australia because our Sunday is their Monday, so we lose a complete day. I also like to use arrows to indicate internal or external responsibilities. So if I'm working with a partner, that lies outside of these four walls. So being able to indicate that a partner is responsible for the next step in the process helps me plan in the event that maybe they're out of the office or they're overloaded at the end of the quarter. It just helps me prep anytime we're kicking off a known project in a lean format, but there's a piece that is owned potentially by a different party. And finally, colors are always great. I love building my decks, and I appreciate a design aesthetic. I'm no marketer like Paul, but indicating colors can tell you if there is a platform, a tool, or how important something is. And then that way you can stay ahead of potential issues. If you know that there's a critical external contractor that's going to be doing content for you, you can stay ahead of potential issues and make sure that they're available as a resource. Continuous flow, probably the biggest one. You've made your map, you understand the value, but you don't want spikes in your production. It's important to take a look at really how much your team can produce efficiently and effectively. If you overload them, you can end up creating bottlenecks because you're pushing so much through a particular team or person or platform or content schedule. You might then have vacancy further down the line, or then you're just creating a problem for the next team. And it really helps you set accurate expectations, not only for the teams that you need to keep happy because they're helping provide that value, but also to your clients. So you're not pushing out 5 or 6 pieces of content. They have exhausted their retainer for the quarter and they have nothing else through the end. Anyone that runs an agency that's tuning in for the webinar, probably familiar with the concept that demand drives production at an agency. But ultimately, having good mechanisms to be able to receive those client requests are going to be important. Sometimes a client's going to send an email to the wrong person, work will get started, it may or may not be a part of your agreement with them, and that causes a lot of inefficiencies. So setting up standing meetings can help, but ultimately having recorded and dedicated channels for communication is going to be the biggest part. I keep saying communication, 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 because that is the most important piece here. Just make sure that anytime you're developing content for your clients, there's great lines of communication internally at your agency, externally with contractors, with the clients, and everything's recorded. Otherwise, you might get yourself into trouble.
Yeah, and speaking of getting into trouble, this is where when we look across our base of agencies, the ones that are really struggling are the ones where that communication, they don't have communication listed out 3 times as Alex did. So they'll create 3 months worth of client content and then talk to their client about it. And the client's like, wait a minute, I didn't like what you did for month 1. So that calibration process is crucial when it comes to content creation.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one as well, that means that month 2 and 3 weren't produced based off of client demand.
Yep.
That probably has value impact.
Yep, absolutely.
Well. It's brutal. So a big core component of lean is every day trying to minimize the 7 wastes, as they call them. Ultimately, lean was actually built as a project management format for industrial companies, manufacturing companies, people that were producing a physical good. So some of them make sense at face value. You don't want to overproduce, you don't want to overprocess, you don't want to keep teams waiting, and you want to get ahead of defects. But then there's some interesting ones that really need to be translated when it comes to people that are looking to adopt parts or this entire framework at their agency, like inventory. Agencies don't really hold a whole lot of inventory typically. Even if they're producing something like getting a banner printed, that is usually something that you just get printed on demand these days. So really one of the best ways to think about inventory are your labor resources internally. Your people produce value for your clients. Make sure that you are managing them effectively, their time, keeping them happy, and that you don't have too much of it. Because if you have too much, you might go out of business. If you have too little, you might go out of business. So it's an interesting balance to strike. Transportation's the next one. When they talk about it in the lean format, they mean literally parts or resources trucking between multiple locations. It could be distribution or the original creation. With agencies, it's more about movement. How often does information need to move between two people? What format does that take? Is it getting shipped in essentially the snail mail of digital communication like email these days? Or is it more over Slack where it's immediate? Is that internal or external? Really figuring out the way that data, content, design is moving in between people and teams, setting a standard for that is going to help people work more efficiently. And then finally is that over-engineering piece. They call it motion, but that's going to be when pieces of the project move between people too often. So do you really need to move a piece of design or content from team to team to team? Or are there some pieces of that process that could be stripped out by giving people more responsibility or by placing the right people on the right team to prevent too much motion going back and forth? Because anytime there is that transportation of details or information, that's an opportunity for there to be more waiting, more defects, more waste.
And Alex, when I talk to agency owners, I think one of the biggest challenges on this waste slides is that labor resources. Especially in agency world where it's feast or famine. You win a big contract, you need to produce, in my world, 400 local landing pages, and you've got 2 in-house content writers. Those content writers are either going to be looking for something to do or completely overwhelmed. And so I think I see a shift in agencies who are really doing well to how do we outsource, how do we use strategic partnerships to smooth out that demand curve so I can not have to turn down a giant contract, or on the other side, I lose my biggest client, do I have to lay off half my workforce?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen that happen. It's happened to friends of mine that live in the agency space and really grown their career there. It can be feast and famine. It's really unfortunate to watch that happen. I guess, how do you advise them on that balancing act of their own labor resources?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, obviously we have a vested interest being an outsourcer ourselves. But what we encourage agencies to do, whether it's us or whether it's individual freelancers, is build up your network and really think about, as an agency, what is your core competency? What are the 1 or 2 things that you do better than anyone else? Keep those in-house and figure out how through partnerships you can outsource some of those other job functions so that you can more easily scale up and scale down with flexible resources.
So it's not even just agencies working with contractors, it's agencies working with agencies.
Yep.
So everybody can win.
Absolutely.
That's very cool. That's awesome. Finally, I've been talking a lot. Improvement. It's huge. It's probably the most important part of Lean once you get to the end stages. You know the value, you've built your processes, everything is running, you're keeping an eye out for potential waste that you can get ahead of. Make sure that you're improving every day. And going back to those 7 wastes, being able to identify them one at a time is a big piece. I'm a big fan of the scientific method. Come up with a hypothesis, maintain your controls, decide how you're going to measure it, and then test and see if whether or not your intended impact was met. I often get surprised by my tests internally around our own data, but make sure that everybody understands the test is going on, what the metrics for success are, and what needs to be controlled. Because if you try to tackle all 7 wastes across all teams and all client projects at the same time, everybody's going to hate you. And likely you're not really going to be able to get down to the core issue of what's going to drive the most impact. I think, for example, one of the conversations Paul and I were having as we were prepping this morning was around content creation itself. There are different writing styles. Even if you're setting your own brand voice, you have the audience in mind. If you asked 10 writers at your agency to all produce the same piece with the same word count directed at the same person, each one of them would be different. So why not do that at your agency for your client communications or for the content delivery? Take 10. If you don't have 10, maybe do 4 and see which ones land the best. Through your marketing automation platforms, you can likely help your clients iterate on content. You almost turn it into a Darwinism of what content works the best, what words, what format, what channel, and really start to hone down on the way that you're generating that content and how it produces the correct value through this lean format.
I think that's incredibly important when it comes to content. One of my favorite quotes is from Larry Kim at WordStream, and he said, I don't even know which of my content pieces are going to perform the best. So it's like, you've got to produce content, you've got to measure, you've got to figure out what worked and then repeat. Excellent. So we're going to talk a little bit about Kanban. I think I heard the word Kanban 2 years ago, and I said, I don't know what that is. And then I thought, someone said Trello, and it's like, oh, okay, that's what Kanban is. As we were researching for this, I thought it was pretty cool that Kanban comes from the Japanese word for signboard or billboard. And that's a really nice way to think about one of the key principles of Kanban, which is presenting project management in a visual way so that you can look at a process end to end, understand how work moves through it. And you'll notice, as Alex and I are talking here, that a lot of the core principles kind of span different project management methods. So you'll hear some of the same things that Alex was talking about in Lean and from Agile as well. And also you can combine these methods. So it's not like you have to pick one and never use principles of Kanban if you like Agile. So kind of pick and choose from what works well for your agency. So again, the key principles of Kanban are: 1, how do we display information visually? 2, how do we move work through a system in a way that's going to be most effective? One thing I really like about Kanban, and we use a lot at Verblio, is this idea that instead of work being pushed to individuals, individuals can pull individual units of work through the system. So we use this on our development team a lot. Our developers, we have a couple of front-end developers, we have a couple of back-end developers, and they all have different bandwidths, they all have different things that they're doing, but by having that backlog on the left there, any one of those developers can look at the backlog, select a piece of work that is going to be best suited to their skill sets and their bandwidth. So I absolutely love that principle when it comes to development. We use that a lot when it comes to content creation as well. This is our actual Kanban board for content creation at Verblio. So Kaylee on my team, who manages our content strategy and runs content marketing for us, designed this Trello board about a year ago. We're on the free version of Trello, so I have no idea how she found that background, but it's pretty appropriate to what she does. But you can see that this is a pretty complex system. So at Verblio, we create a lot of content, and we use a blend of in-house resources. I always tell Kaylee I'm her worst resource because I don't know when the last time that I actually wrote a piece of content was. So we use internal resources, we use individual freelance writers, and then we use our own platform. So managing content through all of that, and creating content for your own site, for guest posts, can get really complex. And so this system allows Kaylee to manage the workflow of all of those pieces of content that are flowing through the system at Verblio.
So you guys use Kanban internally?
We sure do.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've played around with Trello boards. Again, something that was introduced to me by my product and engineering friends. But I did not have a sweet background like that. I need to find one.
And then you guys have a Kanban board built into Accelo as well.
We do, yeah. So we have a board built in there. Luckily for us, or maybe unfortunately for Toyota, nobody ended up trademarking the concept. But I mean, I've even seen our engineering team on the Accelo side put sticky notes up all over the walls here and move things around. So
yep.
I knew what it was for. New people at the company usually have no idea what's going on, but it's good wall decor.
Real world Kanban boards are hot right now.
Yeah, they are. They are. It doesn't just have to be digital, folks. So finally, we wanted to talk a little bit about waterfall. Mentioned at the beginning, we were thinking about incorporating a part in this presentation around waterfall, how to build content in it. But waterfall's been around for a long time, and it's the second most popular project management style for the agencies that work with Accelo. So we thought we might want to just kind of skip past it, and if anything, maybe describe some ways to improve it. Paul had mentioned at the very beginning of his segment on Agile around the pain of moving between project management styles. It's a huge investment for a business. It's a lot of education, there's a lot of change management, it's tough. So instead of completely ripping out something that everybody knows at your business and the way that your business has gotten to the point it is today, maybe you can start to make some small tweaks. Going back to the lean processes, ultimately when I think of waterfall, I think of 4 core wastes to keep an eye out on. Ultimately, when I think of waterfall, I think of 4 potential wastes that we covered in the lean format, just based off the way it's structured. There's nothing wrong with waterfall. People love it. It helps them run their businesses. But ultimately, there are some components that I think you should watch out for overprocessing, defects, how those are reviewed, how much time you leave teams waiting, because it is a very planning up front heavy project management style, and then also over engineering or that motion piece. So as a reminder, that motion piece is when there's ideas, content, design that are moving between too many teams too often. Keeping an eye out for those, waiting. Design, planning ahead before that gets into the production phase. There can be a lot of waiting on that inflection point. Around the over-processing in production to sign off, if there's a lot of work that's going on that's being reviewed before it's really getting approved by somebody else, that can take a lot of time. When you get that sign off and you're keeping an eye out for those defects, some piece of content that's not to spec, the wording's not quite right for the audience, actually you can only place and add that size on these platforms, we need to send it back to design. You're then setting yourself up for potential waiting, potential over processing before you really end up getting through that sign off process. Then finally, the motion piece. I mean, really everything upstream from here is gonna have a lot of motion. But when I think of the motion on delivery, launching that campaign, getting that blog post on the website, it's a lot of hands, it's a lot of versions, it's a lot of back and forth. And if that isn't coordinated effectively, you can spend a lot of time just pushing things around the office. So make sure you have some sort of delivery team. Maybe they're not all on one team together all the time. Maybe it's more of a panel or a board that helps things get out in the market for your clients, and then that'll help minimize the motion when it comes to content delivery.
Yep, and when I think about waterfall and content, I think about an actual waterfall where, you know, once you go over the side, there's no going back. And the issue there is that we think of content as deeply personal. And the example I like to give here is that we have 3,000 writers on our platform. We don't kick off a writer if one client hates them, because we have writers who are absolutely beloved by one client and hated by another client. So content is personal. And if you are using that waterfall methodology that Alex just ran through, and you tell your client, okay, at exactly 12:05 Pacific time on day 45, I'm going to deliver to you this completed piece of content, it doesn't leave you enough room to do that early check-in on, are we getting the brand voice right? You know, are we really aligned with what your goals are? And that inflexibility can cause real problems when it comes to content. As Alex and I were talking about this webinar, I wanted to figure out an example that I could speak to that would really have more broad applications than just what we do at Verblio. So I'm going to run through an example of creating content at scale for a client. And as you listen to this, I'd encourage you to just think through how you might be able to pull bits and pieces from what we were doing here to help content creation at your agency. So one of our larger clients is Rankings.io. Rankings is interesting in that they are an SEO firm that is hyper specialized. So they do SEO, but only for lawyers and only for personal injury lawyers. So that's quite a niche. Wow. Yeah. It's also quite a big niche. They are a pretty big agency. As you can see, we're creating over 400 pieces of content for them per month. It's also a very regulated industry. So as an attorney doing marketing, you have to comply with all of these guidelines and requirements that you have to make sure that your marketing and advertising fits into. So this was a pretty big challenge for us, specifically because Rankings has a unique value prop to their clients where all of their content that they're creating for their lawyers has been reviewed by an attorney. But the challenge there is that if you think of the average attorney, they aren't going to want to create or write content for $30 an hour. So they came to us with this challenge. Can you create 400 pieces of content per month? Can you do it at a reasonable price? And can it all have been reviewed by a lawyer? So we ended up creating a really cool solution for them where we have a two-tiered process. We have regular Verblio writers who have experience in the legal industry. So maybe they were a legal secretary at one point. Maybe they were a paralegal. Maybe they were a journalist that's written a lot about the legal field. So lower cost labor is producing the content, but then we have a layer of editing that sits on top of those writers where a JD editor is reviewing and editing every single piece of content. So I'm going to give a few examples of how we use project management to create these processes and get to this kind of scale. So step number one, thinking way back to Alex was talking about mapping. So that was the very first thing that we did. We took this on the left, you'll see the very first intake form that Ranking sent us. It was about 75 pieces of content in June of last year. And we created this brand new process for how we were going to create these 75 pieces of content given those constraints. So this is probably version 3 of that process that we created. So again, lots of iterating with the client here. Step number 2, use Kanban. So we are creating content at scale here. We are using freelancers. Freelancers may go on vacation. They may get a full-time job. They may take 3 months off to visit France. So we use Kanban to kind of smooth out that creation curve. So if we have a team of 10 freelancers and they're all using that pull methodology that Alex and I talked about earlier, we can ensure that, that content is flowing through this pipeline quickly and efficiently.
Well, and so that's interesting. You mentioned this earlier about content being personal, about some people loving a piece of content while others at the same company could completely hate it.
Yep.
And you just brought up the fact that there could be a contractor that everybody loves, or in this case for Rankings.io, that they need to have some sort of legal experience.
Yep.
Or it absolutely has to get reviewed by a JD, an
Yep.
attorney, to make sure that it falls under compliance. I mean, how do you guys satisfy that if your favorite content writers are the people you absolutely need go out of the office?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like that's going to be a tough one.
It is a tough one, and it's something that we really encourage agencies to think about and plan in advance for. And it's one reason that we encourage our agencies to build small teams of writers as opposed to getting too hooked on an individual writers. So one of the things that we do in our platform, and again, this is broadly applicable regardless of what platform or what system you're using, is we make all of our feedback in the system public to the group of writers who's writing for you. And so the idea is that over time, you will build up this bank of feedback and bank of best practices and rules and guidelines for content for an individual client. And any writer who's coming in can review all of that, all of those rules, all of those sets of feedback, and kind of slot themselves in more seamlessly to that team. Yeah, it took a lot of work to get there, but it's working pretty well. I think that's a nice segue into step number 3, which is calibrating early and often so that you don't have to calibrate as often as you build. So this is a screenshot of my calendar from June of last year. You can see there's a 2-hour block of time. This occurred every single week for 12 weeks.
Wow.
It wasn't my favorite 2 hours of the week, but our goal was to make sure that we were dialed in with the team over at Rankings, that we understood what the needs of their clients were from a content creation perspective, that we're putting all of those rules and requirements into our system. so that now our calibrations are half an hour every other week. And it just allows us to do that scale because we spent the time at the beginning making sure that we understood what they were looking for.
I feel like that amount of time warrants at least a Christmas card. Maybe your graduation invite.
I think so. And step number 4 is collaborating with your clients really closely. And you'll notice this comes directly from some of the project management techniques that we talked about earlier. But building that relationship with your clients allows you to solve problems. And we faced a number of them as we worked through this. Things like writer change, as Alex and I just talked about. Things like, oh, hey, can you produce 30 pieces of ad hoc content on top of the 400 because client ABC really needs them next week. And then obviously SEO is ever changing. Rankings came to us a couple of months ago and said, hey, we're totally changing our strategy for new clients where instead of creating new content, we're going to go and revamp their top 40 blog posts instead of creating content from scratch. So because of that relationship, because we developed these processes in conjunction with them, we were able to shift how we created and what content we created for them quite easily. So again, we're using tools like Slack, like that weekly meeting, like a shared Trello board to make sure that we're staying in really close contact. And finally, Alex talked about this concept of evolving your processes. And we are constantly looking to do that with the team over at Rankings. This is a screenshot of a new process that we presented to them a couple of weeks ago, where we changed the point at which we hand off content. We had been creating all of our content on our platform, handing it off to them in Google Docs. They then go from Google Docs to WordPress. And we said, hey, is there some efficiency to be gained here if our team takes it from the Verblio platform directly into WordPress? Why don't you guys do your editing in WordPress instead of Google Docs? Makes the whole process more efficient and saves them some serious time.
Less motion. I love it.
Less motion indeed. Yep. So 5 quick examples of using project management to do content creation at scale. Hopefully that was helpful.
Awesome. Thanks for the time, Paul. Really appreciate you swinging by the office today. This has been fun. We kind of divided and conquered on the topics, not only in the presentation, but in a lot of the research. We synced out, we reviewed it, but it's pretty good for me to get more background into this. And I'm thinking we might want to implement more Kanban boards and some of the lean partner project management styles that we go through. So we're going to open up the Q&A now. I've got a couple of minutes left here. So you'll see an option to pose questions below. Go ahead and start throwing them in there. We will wait here for maybe about 30 seconds, start grabbing them. If we don't get to you, we will follow up personally via email. And then also we will try to include those in the blog post once we get this webinar recording transcribed and posted on the website and everything. It takes a bit of time, but we will get there.
Yeah, and thanks for having me, Alex. I agree on the project management stuff. I think I'm going to print the 7 waste slide and stick it on my desk because that's something that you should never just let drop. It's not a do it once and you're done. It's continually return to these methods.
We have it at the fridge or on the fridge at home. Yeah, I'm really fun at parties. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Let's jump into the Q&A and go from there.